Welcome back to Conversations for the Good. Good morning, Dr. Jane. I hope you're having a great week.
It's been a good week, Anna. It's always good to be together, though.
It certainly is. In previous episodes, we've discussed relationships and pointed to the importance of healthy boundaries. Our last conversation was specifically about self care. Let's deepen into the what and how of healthy boundaries and why they are essential in self care.
Sure, Anna. Boundaries are the healthy rules and the healthy limits and expectations that we set up within our interpersonal relationships, whether those relationships, are with family or friends, could be with coworkers, our love relationships. Boundaries allow us to feel safe. Um, they also help us balance our stress more efficiently, more effectively. And healthy boundaries also give us a sense of control over our personal space, over our bodies, our feelings, our possessions, and also control over our time and energy. So, with healthy boundaries, we're impacting our self esteem and our self confidence, our overall health, because we're making ourselves a priority. And it's not about controlling others, it's really about taking care of ourselves with self compassion, self respect, and also self acceptance.
You frame boundaries in such a loving and life giving way. Yet, so often boundaries arise out of frustration, anger, and guilt. What is that?
Well, boundaries are the cues that we give others about how to treat us, and in turn, how we're going to treat others. And many times, the cues really aren't expressed openly or clearly or even truthfully. And sometimes, Anna, think about it. I mean, we assume that others know what we need before we even ask them. Or if we have communicated our wants and needs, we think that we shouldn't have to keep telling them. And all these scenarios can trigger, frustration and anger and sometimes resentments. And as you may have already guessed, the whole pattern of setting boundaries or not setting boundaries starts early, in the holding environment of the first 4 years of life. So it's our family history, it's our experiences with church and school, our neighborhood, the friends that we had. It really includes, what was communicated implicitly and explicitly, what we were taught and also what was modeled.
Yes, it seems like it's the whole backstory, the beliefs, the conditioning.
That's right. That's right. And let's think about our own family dynamics, and ask a few questions. Were communications open about what the limits were, what boundaries were? Were they spoken or unspoken? Were you able to express your needs? Were others receptive to your needs? What was happening in the family that really supported and respected healthy limits? What hindered it? Also, were there addiction issues or maybe mental health issues? What was the conflict like in the family? How was it addressed and handled? How were things communicated? How were issues, serious issues or uncomfortable issues? How were they communicated? And the other thing is our individual personalities also play into how tuned in we are to our needs and our wants, and also how comfortable we are with setting and enforcing healthy boundaries and limits. How receptive are we to other people's limits? This all took place early on. And more anxious personalities tend to be more reactive, as do personalities that are rigid and a little more disagreeable, especially when challenged. So the more open, the more receptive, the more we can access our self compassion and our emotional intelligence, really the more likely we'll be to set and enforce healthy boundaries and respect other people's boundaries as well.
Well, how do we know that we need to set boundaries and what prevents us from setting the limits?
Well, we've all been there, Anna. Clear signs that boundaries are needed certainly show up when we have no time for ourselves. We've all been there, feeling burned out, feeling overwhelmed. Um, Sometimes when we feel unappreciated, that's a real sign that we're overloaded. Avoiding interactions that we really enjoy, social interactions, We're so overwhelmed or overextended that we're not returning phone calls or texts or even social invitations. It's that place where we just kind of feel fed up and resentful. So what stops us from setting boundaries? Well, really a myriad of things. Most often it's the fear of the negative reaction that we're going to get if we set up the boundaries or enforce boundaries, whether it's anger or disappointment. So it's really about avoiding conflict. Sometimes there's guilt that maybe I'm going to disappoint someone or they're going to feel abandoned or rejected. Um, sometimes sometimes we get into this rescuing behavior, Anna, and you and I both have talked about this and we know this personally. Our pattern of rescuing is you're not okay and I'm going to help you because I'm going to fix you. And yet we might not have the time and energy to do that. And so we're overwhelmed and overextended. And sometimes it goes unappreciated. But we have this addiction sometimes to being needed, which overshadows our self-care. So it's a way to feel special and important when we're the rescuer because we get to save the day. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Sometimes it's a way that we try to feel loved, but it doesn't work in the long run.
Well, these are powerful pulls regarding why boundaries are necessary and such strong pulls to not pursue healthy boundaries. So, can you tell me again why healthy boundaries are essential to my self care?
I'd be glad to, Anna. I'd be glad to. They're essential to our self-care because they communicate with honor and integrity, you know, our wants and our needs. It's about ourselves. It's about accepting myself and knowing what I need in order to be my best. So with healthy boundaries, I'm able to define expectations. Um, I'm able to define the roles that I want to be operating out of. Healthy boundaries provide a safety net for us. They provide clear communication about acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. They protect us from overextending ourselves and doing things that either are uncomfortable or really don't jive with or are congruent with the things that are aligned with our beliefs and our values. So healthy boundaries provide a clarity about what we want from others and also how we're going to show up for others.
This also sheds light on aspects of unhealthy boundaries and how they show up in relationships.
Well, it sure does. And where there are unhealthy boundaries, there's often a real reluctance to communicate our needs and wants. In unhealthy relationships where there are unhealthy boundaries, there's usually a lack of trust in the relationship. And so often, previous attempts to set up boundaries have ended badly. Sometimes the other person may be unavailable, or refuse to listen to what we have to say, or they don't take our requests seriously. Very often we feel emotionally depleted. Very often we feel, tired, angry, disappointed, stressed out. Sometimes we even want to avoid the other person, and very often in unhealthy relationships, there can be addiction issues or mental health issues. The relationship, if it's unhealthy, boundaries are unhealthy, the relationship can't be mutual and reciprocal. There's really no easy kind of give and take. Sometimes it's mostly take, or the other person wants to give us things that we don't really want or need. Or it might be that in our requests for how we want the limits to play out, it might be that the other person refuses to change their behavior or refuses to really allow us to have the boundaries that we need.
Well, it seems to me that my boundaries have changed over the years. So, how does this fit into seeking healthy boundaries and self care?
Well, boundaries do change over time, Anna. I mean, we change over time. We evolve, and so do our needs and so do our wants. We're in different life stages. So hopefully as we mature, we're able to gain some insight and recognize the importance of being clear in our communication with others and receptive to how others are expressing what they want and what they need. And so often boundaries run on a continuum of loose at one end, kind of loose boundaries, and healthy boundaries kind of in the middle, and then rigid boundaries on the other end.
Well, I could see that many of the examples that you cited are on the loose end of the continuum. Fear of saying no, fear of being rejected. I'm not sure what I want or how to express it. I
Mhm.
don't want to appear mean or needy. What else is on this end?
Well, there's also, and we've talked about this in previous conversations, people pleasing, which is really abandoning ourselves to accommodate others. Or oftentimes relationships can be very enmeshed, so there's really no separation of individuals within a relationship. There's also codependency, which is that feeling responsible in ways for the other person, in ways that we really prevent them from experiencing the natural consequences of their behavior. Enabling behavior is an example of this, where we don't allow other people to be accountable for their behavior. Or sometimes uh, it's about the looseness of providing too much information. We've all had that happen, where someone just kind of spills out all of their life and all of the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's like, well, where is this coming from? That too much information. And Carolyn Mace, who's one of our favorite, authors, also coined a term called woundology. And she talks about relationships that are really based on connecting almost solely out of the pain, out of our deficits, out of our trauma, out of the past. And it always revolves around this. We never move forward in the relationship.
Dr. Jean, what do rigid boundaries look like?
Well, rigid boundaries usually come across as being the individual comes across as being very closed off, very, very restricted in their rules, very strict in the rules and limitations. But also there's a certain restriction that is sometimes unspoken within the relationship. So sharing is very often unlikely, if ever. There's also kind of an edgy, harsh mentality of my way or the highway. With rigid boundaries, there's a lack of emotional intimacy. You really never get to know the person. And sometimes there's a lack of emotional intelligence as well. Very often it's a covering up of all vulnerability. And also, when someone has rigid boundaries, if even with minor infractions of those boundaries, they will cut us off. Or if we're involved in very rigid boundaries, we'll cut somebody off for minor infractions, no communication, no negotiation, you're out. And sometimes ghosting is a behavior that shows up. Minor infractions, I disappear. Don't see me again. There are lots of walls, lots of barriers, no explanations. People just don't let us in when the boundaries are very rigid.
And somewhere in the middle of the continuum are the healthy boundaries, right?
That's right. That's right. And when we land in that healthy range, you know, we're really aware of where we've been, where we've come from, our history, our backstory, and we're also aware of where we are currently, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And this awareness allows us to make very conscious choices with clarity and also the required two-way communication of both expressing my needs, but also listening to others. So there's a real clarity in how our values and our opinions and our expectations are expressed. And we're also able to listen to the wants and needs and opinions of others, not just ourselves, but also of others. We're able to say no when it's needed without feeling guilty or reneging on it. We're open to what others have to say without defensiveness. And we titrate personal information appropriately because we're making a conscious choice about how to be vulnerable and with whom we want to be vulnerable with.
So, setting boundaries must be straightforward if you've done the inside job of self awareness and finding clarity regarding what you want and what you expect.
That's right. And pretty much from there, we're really communicating our wants and our needs, our expectations clearly. And also, what's important is that we follow through with behavior that's aligned with our requests. Because how can we expect others to honor our boundaries if we don't? And when we fail to do this, when we fail to follow up, with the appropriate behaviors that really align with our boundaries, we're not taken seriously. Very often, because no one is accountable. Our needs are kind of dismissed or they dissolve. And our over flexibility kind of becomes the status quo of the relationship, which very often leads to not being seen, not being heard, and leads to resentment, anger, frustration, and sometimes that distancing because we're not having our needs met.
What about if we get clearly negative response to setting boundaries?
Well, and none of that happens. And sometimes the requests aren't taken seriously. Sometimes we don't take others' requests seriously. And some of the typical reactions, negative reactions very often to people setting boundaries or us setting boundaries, is that there's resistance, okay? That kind of, just kind of stonewalling, don't want to go there, ignoring or forgetting the requests, questioning the need for why do we have to do this, the defensiveness, this shouldn't be so. Also testing the limits. We can be met with anger and resentment, silent treatment, sometimes disappearing. It's called ghosting, where it just all of a sudden we can't access the other person. They're nowhere to be found. They don't respond to us at all. But then there's also that chance that by setting up clear boundaries, we're met with acceptance and, that's great. We can move forward. And sometimes it's apparent that either we're not willing to participate in the other's requests or they're not willing to participate in our requests. And then we have to determine the value and meaning of the relationship. How is this meeting any of my needs? How does this fit into my life as I grow and evolve? And sometimes this means restructuring the relationship or letting go of the relationship, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is tough with family.
Oh my goodness, Anna, yes. Family is notorious for being the most challenging, of relationships, for boundaries, given our history and our conditioning. And sometimes a physical boundary is required, it's necessary. Sometimes we have to limit our time with family or our communication with family or limit the level of sharing with family members. It's a tough call for sure.
So we have highlighted various components of boundaries as self-care. It's evident that change is only possible with the conscious choice to communicate what we want, need, and expect, action that implements our boundaries, and consistent follow-up. Much to consider, Dr. Jane.
Absolutely, Anna. Nice summary. Nice summary. Yes.
I try. A lot of helpful information about boundaries as self-care. Thank you, Dr. Jane.
Thank you.
Until our next conversation.